from ferreting into different kinds of slack, we're now going to ferret into the much wider issues around the dynamics in the labour market. And to guide us through that, we have Sarah O'Connor. Over to you, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Torsten's already pretty much said that none of these things have any effect. But, Torsten doesn't know everything. So I think we'll have a really good conversation here. I'll very quickly introduce people. So to my left, we've got Will Abel. He's a senior economist working on labour markets, housing and consumption at the Bank of England. He's going to give our kind of initial presentation. And then to my right, we have Kate Bell. She's the head of economic and social affairs at the TUC. Then there's Alan Manning, who's a professor at the LSE and is also, of course, the chair of the Migration Advisory Committee. And finally, on my far right is Laura Gardiner, who is a very important person at the Resolution Foundation. I think we're short on time, so let's just crack straight on, shall we, Will?
All right. Given that we're short on time, I'll try to be very quick. Thank you very much for inviting me to kind of give some opening remarks. I'd like to do a quick kind of whistle-stop tour of 3 questions to give a backdrop for some discussion. So these are: how much are we producing? How much is going to labour in general? And then where in the labour market is this income kind of going? So we've already kind of heard a lot about the productivity puzzle. Depending on kind of where you want to cut it, what trend you want to use, we are somewhere between kind of 15 and 25% lower in output per hour than we would have been based on pre-crisis trends. Obviously, this feeds very strongly through into pay, as already been discussed. I want to add a couple of kind of factoids, though, to kind of deepen the discussion from some stuff that we've produced at the bank. So firstly, this is the distribution of UK productivity growth, labour weighted by firm. And all this is trying to show is that the slowdown in productivity is at the kind of right-hand side here. It is our kind of largest, most productive firms that haven't been growing as fast as they were pre-crisis. This doesn't seem to be a story of kind of small, innovative firms failing to take off after the crisis. Another point I kind of wanted to address was Paul's point from the earlier panel, which is, given that we've had low pay growth, some economists have argued that this has incentivized firms to switch from capital spending to labour, and thus has led to the kind of in a kind of vicious cycle, led to weak productivity growth. So this is just decomposing our weak pay since the crisis into capital shallowing and actual total factor productivity growth. And what this effectively shows, and it's based on kind of some assumptions, so use this as qualitative rather than very specific, is that maybe about half of the weak productivity has been due to this capital shallowing effect. I would add, though, for the panel, there's definitely further to kind of go in this area. I think lots of people have raised it as an interesting idea to discuss, but haven't ever fully kind of fleshed out the research. So we're producing less. But the good news, is that it seems that about the same amount of this GDP is going to labour. So this is various different measures of the labour share. And since about 2000, as a share of GDP, this has been broadly flat. Now, one interesting kind of change in the labour market recently that should probably get highlighted is an increasing share of labour income is coming through pensions. So what you can see in the blue line, which is the wage share of GDP, is that since 2000, this has been declining somewhat. What I've also done in the red or coral line is trying to strip out firm payments which are filling in pension deficits. So you may think that firms which are spending money on labour income, but for labour income that was done in the 1970s, shouldn't count. So depending on how you squinted it, what you look at, it seems roughly to me that the labour share has been broadly flat, but with this increasing share of income going to pensions. So this kind of puts us as a bit of an outlier internationally. So the IMF did some work last year that was released on the international decline of the labour share. This has been a kind of big topic in the econ literature. So the IMF put it down, a large amount of the decline down to automation worldwide. So one reason why we may have not have seen this decline in the labour share is we're pretty rubbish at automation. So this is us compared to many other countries. We are below the average. We're at about a quarter of the level of automation relative to Germany. Another thing that many people have written about is increasing labour and product market concentration, so-called monopoly and monopsony. We've tried to kind of recreate this work, and while it's wiggled around, as Torsten has said, this doesn't seem to have been a strong issue since the crisis. So this is very much a kind of open area for debate, and I look forward to seeing kind of future research on this. Generally, the measures that we've constructed in the bank show that these have actually been declining since the crisis. And finally, I thought I would highlight a couple of nicer areas of labour market and pay, just given the backdrop. So firstly is that if you don't like Phillips curves, a new kind of area of research are these job ladders, which put a lot of pressure on, or focus on, switchers and stayers and their pay rises. So what we've seen recently is that those who switch jobs are now starting to see the pay rises that they were pre-crisis. Now, hopefully this is indicative of kind of increasing pressures in the labour market actually coming through, and one would hope that this will feed through into the wage growth of job stayers. But at the moment, that is the area in the labour market where we see kind of the relative weakness. And then the final thing is the distribution of the wage growth that we've seen since the crisis. Again, like productivity, this has actually been mostly concentrated in high earners. Over the last 5 years, wage growth at the bottom end of the distribution has actually been relatively robust, mainly thanks to the national living wage. Before I get shouted at, obviously, though, this is balanced off by between low earners suffering the most during the crisis in terms of pay, as shown by the green line. So, apologies for being incredibly kind of rapid there. I hope this gives the panelists something to discuss, and thank you very much.
That was fascinating. I think every one of those slides I would have liked to have stared at for about 10 minutes to digest. But anyway, maybe people can get them later. Kate, do you want to come in?
Great. So thanks so much for asking me to speak. I thought while I was kind of thinking about this question where we're grappling with which, particularly in the recovery, why isn't pay rising, that it would be helpful to kind of think about the determinants of what actually happens when pay is set, who makes those decisions and why. And just my kind of quick thinking about this came up with kind of 4 ways in which we actually determine pay. So firstly, government sets wages through the national minimum wage, then with ripple effects up the distribution. Secondly, we have some still kind of collective bargaining in the UK with the representative trade union, and we have some kind of ripple effects from campaigning there as well. I think it's quite interesting seeing McDonald's and Amazon both responding to kind of trade union campaigning by raising their wages. Thirdly, we have people moving jobs and asking for higher pay when they move, and we've talked, I can't remember if today someone has already put up a slide about job-to-job moves declining and that being one of our determinants. And then fourthly, we have kind of firm-wide pay settlements, so the kind of annual pay round, which is determining most people's probably level of pay. And I just thought it would be interesting to think about what are the kinds of decisions that people actually take when they're setting these different pay determinants. So thinking about government setting wages, I'm lucky enough to be on the Low Pay Commission, so I know a bit about that. There's obviously an assessment of the economy, but I think it's worth noticing at this point that we've just seen the graph about pay did go up at the bottom end of the distribution. And when we're kind of arguing about, is it possible for pay to rise, what's happening with productivity, what's happening in the wider economy, well, it was totally possible for pay to rise at the bottom end of the distribution when government said it has to. We haven't seen huge effects on profitability of firms. We haven't seen kind of an effect on unemployment, despite some of the dire warnings. So we know when kind of there's real clear action, pay can actually go up. What about kind of firms deciding on pay settlements? Well, I think it's kind of arguable whether in the absence of pressure from workers, firms voluntarily decide just to raise wages. But this is where most of the debate takes place. So we're mostly debating what is the capacity of firms to raise wages, given productivity increases, given the total amount of demand in the economy. I think another thing perhaps we should be looking more at, and again, this kind of relates to the monopsony point, but also different business models. So this is pretty anecdotal, but I think there's some evidence that pay setting is kind of done on a norms type basis. So, you know, firms say, 2% pay rises are now the norm, this is what's happening, kind of competing with workers. And I think some evidence that kind of changes in business models and possibly the role of private equity, and again, this is anecdotal at the moment, have started to say there are fixed labour costs. We expect labour costs to be a certain amount of certain amount of our kind of total spending, and therefore 2% is our norm, and that's not budging, basically. So I think that's something that deserves more research. Again, as I say, it's kind of anecdotal. But I guess the question still remains about why are workers not asking for higher pay rises? What's actually going on here? And kind of, I think Paul Gregg said earlier, you know, why are nominal pay rises responding differently to inflation? I guess that question is, why aren't workers asking for more? And of course, this is what the concept of slack is meant to capture. But in thinking about this, I think there's also kind of worth thinking about what I decided to kind of term a kind of idea of kind of psychological slack. So workers' ability to actually have the confidence to ask for pay rises. We've talked about the level of unemployment, but I think it's also worth thinking about the kind of scare resulting from the recession, workers' kind of confidence in that area. I'm really pleased to see the Resolution Foundation talking about atypical employment, which we have been banging on about for quite a long time as perhaps one of the determinants of this. But I think there's also some kind of other factors maybe we should take into account. The last 10 years are a kind of period in which we've seen employment rights significantly diminished. Period for unfair dismissal was doubled, for example. That's not sending a message to workers that you can be confident in your labour market position. We've had the public sector pay freeze, again, setting different pay norms and making people think it's not necessarily normal for pay to go up every year. And then, of course, we've had significant benefit cuts, which also might be having a kind of impact on labour market confidence. And finally, I would say this, wouldn't I? But, you know, we can say the decline of trade unions hasn't changed, but we haven't had a kind of strong countervailing power or the ability to kind of give workers that confidence that actually, yes, now you could start to be bargaining for wages. So I've got 24 seconds left, this slightly terrifying clock is telling me. But I just wanted to end by saying what would happen if workers did have that greater power? And I think there is a real debate about, well, would it just lead to kind of cost-push inflation, if that's what's going to happen? Or would we see firms having to invest more in kind of capital as labour became less cheap? And I think that's a really interesting question we could perhaps discuss.
Wow. To the second, very impressive. Thank you, Kate. Alan.
Yeah, I mean, I had hoped to have a morning actually not talking about immigration, but it took the second question before it came up. So I fear that I sort of have to do that. So I'll talk a bit about the role that immigration has or has not played in all of this. Well, first of all, think about the way in which immigration may affect average wages. There's a composition effect that when we look at average earnings, recent migrants are in that average. And, you know, for example, some of the pay differentials are very big. So migrants from the accession countries, those that joined after 2004, on average earn about 30% less than other workers in the UK economy. That's a big gap. And their share of the UK workforce has risen by about 4 percentage points since 2004. So that has been a drag on UK average wages, but of about 1.2% over a 13-year period. So this is like, they had that predominantly lower skill EU migration has contributed a little bit to making the UK a lower wage, probably lower productivity kind of a place, but it's not a huge effect. And even that composition effect isn't saying that there's been any effect on the wages of other UK residents, of UK-born workers. It's just a sort of batting average effect. And I think that, but I do think the view is that immigration hasn't played an important role in weak wage growth. And the reason that I think that people think that it does, but it hasn't, is that I think the biggest mistake in thinking about the impact of immigration on the labour market is to think of labour demand. Immigration is essentially labour supply. Increase in immigration is increase in labour supply. Is to think of labour demand as being somehow independent of labour supply. So a lot of people talk as if the number of jobs in the economy is fixed, and then you've got independent variation in labour supply. And that's what economists call the lump of labour fallacy. It's not a phrase actually I like, but that's what economists call it. And it comes in two flavours. One flavour is the view that if you have more immigration and the number of jobs is fixed and one of those migrants doesn't work, that's got to be at the expense of a British worker and so must cause unemployment. But the other version of the flavour of the fallacy is that if you have less immigration, that there will inevitably be more shortages in the labour market as well. And there are many people who will run a mile from the first version of the fallacy and quite happily put out the second version. So why is it fundamentally a fallacy? I think if you think about it from the perspective of an individual employer, it's quite natural for them to think that if they've got a shortage of workers, if they can resolve that shortage by hiring a migrant, then the shortage goes away. But the problem is that then that migrant earns money and they spend that money. And in doing so, they raise the demand for labour elsewhere in the economy, increasing shortages everywhere else. So all that migration is doing is shuffling shortages around the economy. Now, it may be you're talking about very skilled workers, and so not all migrants are the same, and so on. But basically, that it's not what, from the perspective of an individual employer, is solving labour shortages, isn't from the perspective of the economy as a whole. And the evidence for this view that really employment growth and labour demand is primarily driven by labour force growth is actually, I'll refer you back to the interim report we produced in the spring. We had a couple of graphs in there which I think illustrate this sort of very clearly, and also make it clear that you don't need permanent increases in the labour force in order to have high rates of wage growth and productivity growth. That there's essentially no connection between individual standards of living and general levels of immigration and labour force growth. So I think that's. If you forgive me, I'll just talk in 30 seconds, not only about immigration, about how I see the current situation. I think I would go along with what Kate says, actually. I think there are very powerful norms. I'm old enough to remember when the norm was 8% nominal wage growth, and everybody said we're never, ever going to get that different. And I think that what has happened is that employers, and I visit quite a lot of employers, have just got out of, they just follow this norm, and running a business is really hard. I'm not going to be as good as timing on you. They just have a particular way of thinking about it. But what I do think that means is that I like this sort of earthquake analogy, that the pressure on the fault is building up, that after a while there will be things that will shift norms, and then things might change quite fast. But that's a beauty for an academic forecaster, because like an earthquake, you can say there will be a change at some point in the future, but I can't say when. And so it's a win-win situation for me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alan. Laura?
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for the very important person introduction. I might see if I can get that made my official job title. So I think one of the clear messages from what we've heard so far today is that productivity is the biggest deal in terms of the past, present and future of wage growth. That said, it's not really something I'm going to talk about. In the main, I'm going to pick up on some things that lots of people have mentioned so far, discussing three possible drivers of wage pressure that aren't immediately about productivity. So I'm going to talk about monopsony, mobility, and the makeup of the workforce, which, just to be clear, is my way of talking about compositional effects with a word that begins with M. On each of these, I'm going to focus on what the future might hold. And as I said, when you come this far down the list in a conference, everybody said pretty much everything you wanted to say. But this is a very complicated topic area, so I've decided there's no harm in repetition. So to the first M, monopsony, we've heard from both Torsten and Will that as best we can measure, labour market concentration has fallen a bit since the relatively stronger pay growth years of the early 2000s. And that's just a story on which I want to reiterate three notes of caution. The first is that just because the change in concentration doesn't provide an explanation for the slowdown in pay growth, doesn't mean we should necessarily be blasé about its level. The second is that most of the analysis of monopsony is at the national level, and it's perfectly possible that trends are different in the cities and regions within which labour markets actually operate. And the third is that while strongly related, falling concentration is not the same as bargaining power. It says nothing about union density or the way in which the security of contracts affects the bargaining position, as Kate touched on. So unfortunately, I don't really think we know what monopsony means for the future of pay growth. And I do think this is an area where the past may not necessarily be a very good guide to the future. But there are some really important questions here we should keep probing on. The second M is mobility. And we know from what Will said that the job switching pay premium has been roughly maintained. But as Kate said, voluntary job-to-job moves are still around 10% below they were pre-crisis. And we also know that moving region for work within the UK, which results in an even bigger pay rise than just moving jobs, is down quite a bit from where it was at the turn of the millennium. And the reason why I think this mobility piece is so important is because it's not just about the big pay rises for the individual, but it seems to have spillover effects. So, for example, it seems logical that firms losing staff to resignations might raise the pay of those who remain behind to prevent further departures. So in terms of the future implications of mobility for pay growth, I can see a headwind and a tailwind. The tailwind is that mobility is slowly rising, and further labour market tightening, for example, the reduction in the underemployed job searches we heard about in the previous session, might finally break open those job vacancy chains, or I think Will called them ladders, that allow job-to-job moves to proliferate. But the headwind is that, as Alan's touched on, we might be heading towards a world of lower migration, and migrants tend to be the most likely to move jobs. For example, they're twice as likely to relocate for work as the UK-born. So on to my third and final M, which is the makeup of the workforce. Torsten and Paul have talked about the reduction in the compositional boost from occupational and qualifications upgrading, explaining some of the pay slowdown. And I think this underscores a really important point that we made as part of our intergenerational commission, that although today's young adults are the best educated generation ever, that there has been a slowdown in cohort-on-cohort improvement in human capital since the 1990s. And this type of thing takes time to feed through. So I think, for example, the effect we've seen in recent years could be a result of the mid-2000s slowdown in university entries. And the point is that even if we were to fix our skills supply system tomorrow, and in particular the woeful underinvestment in vocational routes, it would take a fair bit of time for these effects to feed through. So unfortunately, I think our skills upgrading headwind is here to stay for a while. So to conclude, these three M's I've talked about, monopsony, mobility, and the makeup of the workforce, are really important considerations for issues quite apart from productivity growth, not least the distributional implications of labour market concentration and a world of slower educational upgrading. And Paul did touch on that from a social mobility perspective. But to wrap up, I'm obviously going to return to productivity. So if we think that the extent to which labour markets are concentrating, and crucially how that relates to product market concentration, if we think about that, if we think about the rate at which labour moves to high growth and innovating firms in our economy, and if we think about rates of workforce upskilling, it's pretty obvious that none of these things can be separated out from productivity growth. So I think my final point is getting to grips with these three M's is actually not just about pay, but a really important part of understanding where our productivity problems lie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. You all kept to time, which is great, because it means we will have time for questions. And because I'm the chair, I'm going to exploit my power to ask the first one. Laura, you just kind of linked back all of these things we've been discussing with productivity, and I wanted to ask in particular about the links between immigration and productivity. And maybe I'll start with Alan, but I'd like to know what you all think. Is it falling into some sort of fallacy to think that it's possible, part of the reason that firms have been haven't been investing capital, but have been kind of relying on a fairly labour-intensive business model because they have had access to a plentiful supply of relatively cheap, relatively well-qualified labour from the EU? And if so, what does that mean for the drivers of productivity post-Brexit? Alan?
I mean, I think our overall view is that it hasn't been a big part of the productivity slowdown story. It dates primarily from the financial crisis more than, for example, accession in 2004. So, and I think the sort of empirical studies that we sort of commissioned are a bit unsatisfactory, actually, because some of the estimates are not really very plausible when set in a wider context. Suggests that it isn't primarily about immigration, but there is a slight, the one place it does cause a headwind is that it causes the labour force to grow faster than it otherwise would. So in order to keep the same level of capital per worker, you have to, that uses up a certain fraction of the investment. So you get, if productivity growth essentially comes from capital deepening, it essentially causes a slight headwind on that, but I don't emphasise the word slight.
Will, what do you think about immigration and productivity?
I mean, we've got Alan Manning on the panel. I just got to bow to everything he says on this. I'm stepping away from, I agree strongly with basically everything Alan said. The only thing I think is interesting is, as we kind of showed in the third slide, half of this might be capital shallowing, capital deepening, but there is also still this TFP kind of puzzle, and you get this kind of disturbing research by kind of John Van Reenen and co saying it's harder and harder to find new ideas, and that's definitely something that should be a kind of concern or worry for us in the economy going forwards.
Does anyone want to disagree with Alan Manning?
No one ever does, actually. I mean, it's incredible how much people agree with everything I say.
You have, yeah.
I did want to make another point, which is I think it's too easy to just say firms' ability to rely on cheap labour relies on migration. I think what we should be talking about is why else firms have been able to rely on cheap labour and how that might be holding back productivity, which, as I tried to set out, are lots of things we could actually be addressing. It's too easy to kind of jump to migration and say, oh, that's why firms have got a low-wage labour model rather than a capital-intensive model. As Alan, no one's going to disagree with Alan, but there are many other reasons why they might be pursuing that type of model.
Yeah. Great. Okay, let's open it up to questions. I'm sure there are loads. There are loads. Okay, I'm going to take you in groups of 3. So there's a woman here, there's a man here at the front, and then there's someone sort of at the back there. Yeah, there's another woman at the back there.
Pamela Corder, Southbank University. I wanted to ask about a gender analysis, that if you actually did a gender analysis of all your charts, would there be big differences? And also, is it possible to do it? Are the figures collected in such a way that it's possible to do it? And just as part of that, I mean, since about 2010, anecdotally at least, we think that women have got pushed out of the workforce. And there's maybe a whole area of slack in terms of mothers with young children, where the fact that there's no childcare means that they actually can't work even if they want to. So I just think there's a whole unexplored area there.
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, man here.
Thank you. John Myers from the London YIMBY Housing Campaign. I was thrilled to hear Laura talk about the impact of labour mobility and reduced labour mobility on productivity. I'm sure Will is aware of the Enrico Moretti study in the States talking about shortage of housing and what that does to impact high wages. So would the panel agree that we should look at the shortage of housing, especially in high wage places, as one of the possible ways of improving productivity and hence pay?
Excellent. And yeah, there's a woman at the back there. She's got a pen in the air.
Thank you. I'm Mary Daszewski. I write for The Independent. I apologise for going back to migration, but I would like to ask Alan Manning. You said that people working also, that they don't just earn, but they spend. But isn't it true that the spending patterns among especially many recent migrants are actually quite different from native workers, in that an awful lot gets sent back in remittances? So I wondered whether it's actually true to say that the amount spent is actually proportional to the number of extra workers. Thank you.
Very good challenge. Great. Okay, so to recap, Pamela, can we have some sort of gender analysis of all of these numbers, particularly with reference to women who maybe aren't contributing as much as they want to because of childcare? John, shortage of housing, if we fix it, can we solve the productivity puzzle? And then a question from The Independent on, are migrant spending patterns actually comparable to native workers' spending patterns? Who wants to start? Will, why do you start?
Okay, so quickly just running through. So on the gender analysis, definitely absolutely possible for most of the labour market statistics that we showed. Things on productivity are usually collected at the firm level, and so I very much doubt that it's possible to do the kind of gender cuts there. Would be interesting. I haven't done those. On the urban economics Enrico Moretti point, I think it's a fascinating area of growing literature, one that has yet to kind of take off in the UK. One word of caution I would have is in the same way as monopsony and monopoly are kind of big deals in the US that don't seem to be as big deals in the UK, we need to be careful at transferring the cutting edge research, which is US centric, to the UK, especially when the kind of policy conclusion for the UK would be even more people going to London, even more London centric, which might be the answer that we want, but something we should be kind of cautious about from normative perspectives probably. The immigration demand and supply point, given that we have kind of outflows in the form of remittances, does that mean that kind of saying that demand and supply equally match off? I think it's ultimately an empirical question. I completely kind of see that as being a reasonable argument, but then when we apply the empirics to it, it seems that these things kind of do net off. And with difficult questions like this, I ultimately go, we just have to go to the data. And the more and more we go to the data, unless you're George Borjas, you kind of get the same results that Alan Manning seems to get.
Anyone else?
So just a point on the gender analysis, I don't think there is evidence that women have been falling out of the labour market, but I wonder if it's one of the other factors, maybe restricting labour mobility or restricting your ability to ask for more. If you've got yourself into a job where you have got decent flexible working practices, which we know there's a huge demand for, maybe that's one of the factors which stops you saying, oh, I'm also going to ask for a pay rise. So I think that would be really interesting to look at. I sort of wanted to make the same point as well, just on the labour mobility point, where I get a bit worried about this kind of argument that the problem is more people aren't moving to London and more people aren't moving to productive kind of, you know, the productive places. And kind of to put it one way, maybe we should be talking more about capital mobility and why businesses aren't moving to places where there are plentiful labour supplies rather than the other way around.
It's a good point. Quickly on that gender thing, it's also true that, I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence that there are lots of women who are overqualified for the jobs that they're doing. And that's because a lot of the jobs that deliver the sort of flexibility you might need when your children are small are not the ones that require the degree that you might have. So maybe that's a productivity puzzle point. Alan?
Yes, I mean, I'll take the migration one first, which is actually, one of the papers we commissioned for the last MAT report actually did look a bit at differences in spending patterns to try and assess things like tax receipts through indirect VAT and things like that. And there are more remittances, but it's not really a huge effect, I think, is the bottom line. I mean, when I say that sort of it's a first approximation, migration just increases the size of the labour force. Obviously, they do alter the mix in lots of the population, the labour force, in ways. But often those effects are relatively small. So I don't think actually remittances are a big thing in here, and they have other differences in spending patterns that may possibly go in the other direction as well. I mean, on shortage of housing, I sort of worry about it being a London-centric effect, if whether this concentrating people in London is at the expense of depopulating the regions. And, you know, one of the big problems we've got is regional inequalities. And that work from Moretti and so on, you know, it isn't clear that you necessarily benefit from agglomeration economies of having more and more people in this one place, if at the same time you're depopulating other places, which is driving those places down.
Great. Laura?
I'll pick up on the first two. So in terms of the pay squeeze across genders, the evidence suggests the squeeze was potentially a bit shallower for women, although that doesn't get us away from the fact that there is still a sizable gender pay gap and a lot of structural challenges to address in our labour market in terms of the employment of women. But your point about women potentially dropping out of the labour force due to childcare reasons, I'd highlight stats updated by the ONS last week that shows that maternal employment rates are now higher than the employment rates of non-working age women who aren't mothers, and that's a massive crossover over a 2-decade period. And I think this is an area where we really can point to a policy success of triangulating between rights, maternity rights and so forth, conditionality and financial support. We don't talk about successes enough. I think that's one, and I think that highlights where our ongoing failure is, and that's to come up with the same kind of answer to employment for people with health problems and disabilities. On the Moretti point, I agree. I think organisations like the CBI frequently highlight the cost and shortage of housing in high employment areas as a cause for concern. So I think that's definitely something to think about. And then just to plug, everybody said, oh, don't necessarily take the Moretti agglomeration stuff from the US as applying to the UK. Well, luckily at the Resolution Foundation last year, we replicated the Moretti analysis for the UK. And I can't quite remember the details, but I think Will's suspicion was right, which is that we do find some effects, but they're not to the extent of what Moretti said about the US. So I'd encourage you to go and look for that on our website.
Excellent. More questions? Okay. The two men here, and there's a woman here. Actually, maybe we should take a few more. There's also a woman at the back there, and that man. Right, we're going to do 5, but that's going to be the last, I think, so we are a bit short on time.
Thank you. Tony Wilson from Institute for Employment Studies. I'm interested in the point Torsten made earlier about the contribution of qualifications and occupations to productivity growth, and accepting Laura's point that sort of shifting the dial through vocational reform for young people will take a long time. I do wonder if there's still things we can do here, particularly about, given the sort of skills mismatches that we know exist in the economy, shortage vacancies being close to record levels, underinvestment by employers, and 2 thoughts in particular. One is the role of the Public Employment Service, which has become a kind of a claimant employment service. Is there more we can do to look at how we encourage kind of poaching and disloyalty and greater moves between jobs for those who are in low pay and low work to address this point about low flows? And secondly, workplace training. You know, given where we are on the apprenticeship levy, do we need to think more broadly and more boldly about reforms that might boost workplace investment in skills
James Smith, Resolution Foundation. So I just wanted to thank everyone for a really interesting set of presentations, been really insightful. And I completely buy the idea that weak productivity is crucial to weak wages, and people have made that point in a number of different ways. But I think the big risk is that's where the conversation stops. And I'm not saying that's particularly what's happened here this morning. There's definitely been some attempts to go further than that. But the idea that you can take observed output per worker and say, oh, right, the crisis came along in 2007 and suddenly technical progress ended and we suddenly became really bad at thinking of new ideas and thinking of learning by doing and all the other drivers of underlying technical progress that we think are out there, I think is a little far-fetched. It seems a little bit too much of a coincidence to me. So, and this really matters because certainly for macro policy making, if the Bank of England and the Treasury assume that the rate of productivity growth, the underlying growth rate of the economy is low, then that will be self-fulfilling because they will set policy in a way that delivers that. So this is a really crucial question. So I wanted to ask the panel a very simple question of what is the single most convincing explanation that you see for weak productivity and what should we do about it?
Oh God, that's a whole panel in itself. Okay. There was a woman over here. So, yep.
Hello, Lee Powell from Unison. I'd like to make the link, I think you'll expect, between trade unions and productivity. Unions were blamed for poor productivity back in the 70s and 80s because of the effect on collective bargaining and the lack of labour market flexibility that was believed to bring. We've seen a lot of legislation to reduce the rights of trade unions, and yet we still had a productivity problem. So firstly, can we conclude that trade unions weren't the problem with productivity? And should unions, in fact, in their role in promoting the training of workers and investing in the skill of their workers, actually be the answer to the productivity problem?
Okay, great. Very linked questions. There was a woman at the back there.
So I'm Sam from the Department for Business and Energy, and our industrial strategy does seek to address issues in productivity as a priority. I'd love to hear a bit more from Will on your slide 3, and particularly more from the panel about firms not investing in labour-saving technology because wages are so cheap, just to explore what firms' positions may be on productivity there.
Great. And then there was one more. Yeah, this man here.
Thanks. David Arnold, also from Unison. Just want to echo Paul's point from the first panel and get this panel's view on one of the things he said. He was talking about the need to focus on pay and productivity together. He was reflecting on how they're mutually supportive. Just thinking about one of the ideas that Labour have in their programme at the moment, in their manifesto for sector-level bargaining, and be interested to hear whether people think that could be part of the solution to the pay and productivity problem that we face.
Great. Well, that is really useful that all of those questions were basically very similar, and they were all about productivity and the links between pay in various ways. So don't feel the need to address all 5 of them because we don't have time, but if each of you want to kind of pick up and make 1 point each, that would be great. Will, start with you.
All right, I'll try and just kind of make very rapid responses. One interesting point, I think, on qualifications and productivity growth that doesn't get as much attention as it should is that the graduate premium has fallen substantially in the last decade. I think the last time I estimated it is something from 28% to 21% over about 10 years. Single biggest reason for the productivity crisis, given its international nature, I worry that Robert Gordon's got it right, and that was just something that explained the 1900s, and now we're just going to have to get used to low productivity. Unions and productivity, I think unions are mostly an argument about inequality, and I think that's where most of the evidence shows, so they determine that kind of labour share picture that I put up earlier rather than the total size of the pie. And then capital labour substitution thing, I think there needs to be a lot more research in here. This is an interesting argument. We've got some cheap labour. Has it caused a substitution? All we're doing is kind of an arithmetic accounting exercise to get those charts that we showed, and no one has really kind of taken this further. So if we've got any PhD graduates in the room who'd like to do that, we'd appreciate it.
Kate.
Well, I think maybe the point the first question was getting at was if we had a higher level of government spending and aggregate demand, would we have higher productivity? And we think definitely yes. And then I guess I agree with my union colleagues. Unions definitely are a critical part of the solution. And I think two kind of routes in which unions help. One is by raising the cost of labour and therefore increasing the incentive to invest in capital. But secondly, also by the critical role of giving people a voice in the workplace. And we know that when people have a voice in their workplace, they're much more likely to adopt new technology. They're much more likely to be able to give ideas about how productivity on the shop floor could be improved. They're more likely to be secure at work and therefore also raise their productivity. So I think it's a really important, as I would, but I think there's really good evidence that there's a really important part of the solution there.
Great. Alan?
Well, I think it's important to realise that we're not even at the current technological frontier. We lag. Our productivity is a long way behind, say, somewhere like Germany, which has similar employment rates. Within every sector in the UK, there's a huge dispersion in productivity, so it's just obvious that there's not every employer who's at current best practice. Now, why does that happen? I think a little bit sometimes I do feel productivity doesn't grow except by somebody making decisions which make it grow, even though economists model it as dropping, from the sky. And I think businesses, when they're, running business is really, really hard the whole time. And, they often feel they haven't quite got the space to think about how to do things a bit better. And there perhaps isn't sometimes the pressure because of weak wages to think about how to use labour more effectively because labour is becoming more expensive. So I think there's perhaps a little bit in that. But if we just concentrated on getting to more people getting to best practice, we'd have things would be quite a lot better even now.
Some low-hanging fruit there. Laura?
So I'll just pick up on the one question that wasn't directly about productivity, although obviously, as I said, everything is in the end, which was Tony's about skills. So Tony said, I focused on, vocational routes for young people coming through, but what about workplace training? And it's a really important point to highlight because we know that that has declined substantially, particularly in certain low-paying sectors. And you also talked about how employment services can encourage poaching and disloyalty. Again, picking up on the emphasis I placed on mobility. These are 2 points that I absolutely agree with, and we did do some thinking on these issues as part of our intergenerational commissioners, as part of if we haven't had this massive increase in unemployment this time round that we know from the work of Paul Gregg and others causes long-term scarring effects. What are the long-term effects of spending the early years of your career stuck in low pay, and what might active labour market policy need to do to respond to that? So we have done some thinking about what an employment service that does encourage disloyalty and poaching, that does try and get that on that in-work training after you've come out of your formal education years moving, and that's set out in the final report of the Intergenerational Commission that was published earlier this year.
Great. Well, the clock is sort of flashing very red, so we need to go and let you have some coffee. But please give a round of applause to all of our excellent panellists.